What kind of leader would set fire to his own land, destroy his villages, and force his people into suffering, all in a calculated move to break the spirit of a far superior army? In the spring of 1462, this question was answered by Vlad III, the notorious voivode of Wallachia, known to history as Vlad Tepes or Vlad the Impaler. His brutal resistance against the Ottoman Empire under Sultan Mehmed II would become legendary, leaving an indelible mark on both history and the psyche of his enemies. Vlad's opponent, Mehmed II, had already earned fame as the conqueror of Constantinople, one of the greatest victories in Ottoman history. With an army estimated at 90,000 soldiers, he was more than capable of crushing any resistance he faced. But when Mehmed launched his campaign into Wallachia to overthrow Vlad in 1462, he encountered something entirely unexpected. Instead of facing a conventional army waiting to battle in the fields, Mehmed's troops entered a barren, desolate wasteland. Vlad had transformed his own land into a weapon of war. Villages were burned to the ground, fields were scorched, and the very water supplies were poisoned or destroyed. Homes were reduced to ash, granaries emptied, and livestock either driven away or slaughtered. This wasn't just cruelty, it was a strategy. Vlad knew his army was far smaller than Mehmed's overwhelming force. Traditional battle was not an option. His only chance for survival was to break the will of the Ottomans through a scorched earth policy that left them with nothing. According to contemporary records, including accounts from Byzantine chronicler Leonikos Chalkokondyles, Vlad's destruction was meticulous. It wasn't just random destruction, it was a calculated military tactic designed to starve and demoralize the Ottoman forces. Entire populations were evacuated or slaughtered, ensuring the invaders would find no shelter, no food, and no information as they advanced through Wallachia. As Vlad himself later described in a letter to Matthias Corvinus of Hungary, he had killed peasants, men and women, old and young, adding, "We have burned down everything." The psychological impact was immense. The Ottoman soldiers, unfamiliar with the terrain, found themselves trapped in a hostile land. Disease spread through the ranks, and hunger gnawed at the invaders. They were exhausted, demoralized, and unable to advance in any meaningful way. It wasn't traditional warfare. It was a war of attrition, designed to break the enemy without a single battle. And it worked. Ottoman morale began to collapse as their forces weakened under the stress of starvation, disease, and an unrelenting environment. Soldiers deserted their posts, not because they were defeated in combat, but because they could not survive in a land stripped of all resources. Vlad's strategy was devastatingly effective. What he lacked in numbers, he made up for in sheer psychological warfare. As Sultan Mehmed II's army pressed further into Wallachia, hoping to crush Vlad's resistance once and for all, they faced a more chilling sight than just empty fields and burned homes. The landscape itself became a terrifying display of power and defiance. When the Ottomans reached the fortress of Târgoviște, the heart of Vlad's domain, they were greeted by an unimaginable sight. Thousands of bodies displayed on tall wooden stakes, forming a grotesque forest of death. These were not just the bodies of common soldiers, but also prisoners, spies, and even diplomats captured by Vlad's forces. This horrifying spectacle was not just about death. It was a carefully crafted psychological message meant to paralyze the Ottoman army with fear and dread. The decision to display the bodies of captured Ottoman soldiers, high-ranking envoys and spies on stakes was a deliberate act of terror. According to Venetian and Ottoman sources, the stakes were arranged in such a way that they appeared like a forest of fallen figures. The intention was clear, to shock and demoralize Mehmed's men, making them question the very nature of the enemy they faced. These were not just bodies. They were symbols of Vlad's unyielding resolve, his willingness to go to any length to defend his land and people. One particularly gruesome account comes from the 15th century Saxon chronicle of Brasov, which tells of Vlad's brutal treatment of Ottoman envoys. The story goes that when a group of envoys from Mehmed's camp arrived to negotiate, they refused to remove their turbans before Vlad, a sign of respect in their culture. In response, Vlad had the turbans nailed to their heads, and the envoys were executed and displayed on stakes. While the exact details of the event may be lost to history, the message was unmistakable. Defy Vlad, and you would face a death more terrifying than anything you could imagine. For the Ottoman soldiers, this was a level of cruelty and psychological warfare they had never encountered before. According to Ottoman chroniclers, even the toughest soldiers in Mehmed's army were shaken by the sight of the impaled bodies, which lined the roads leading to key towns like Bucharest and Târgoviște. The sight was not just of death, but of a ruler who had weaponized terror in ways they could not comprehend. It was a display of power that transcended conventional warfare, aimed directly at the heart of Ottoman morale. As Mehmed's army marched deeper into Wallachia, they were confronted not just by a physical wasteland, but by the cold, calculated cruelty of Vlad's tactics. For the Ottomans, the true horror of Vlad's strategy lay not just in the destruction of villages or the slaughter of soldiers, but in the complete and utter humiliation of their forces. Vlad Tepes's signature method of terror was impalement, a brutal form of execution that went far beyond a mere punishment. It was a weapon of control, a strategy designed to instill fear in both his enemies and his own people. While impalement itself was not a new practice, Vlad perfected it, turning it into an instrument of psychological warfare on an unprecedented scale. The process was horrific. A long wooden stake was driven through the body of the victim, often starting at the lower torso and emerging from the top. This wasn't a quick death. The stakes were deliberately shaped to prolong suffering, ensuring the victim would be alive for hours or even days while pinned to the earth. The body would remain in a state of agony, a living display of terror for all to see. Vlad used impalement not just in times of war, but as a tool for maintaining order within Wallachia, using it to punish perceived enemies and enforce his will on the people. The sheer scale of impalement during Vlad's reign was staggering. Historians report that during his campaign against Mehmed II in 1462, approximately 20,000 captives, mostly Ottoman prisoners, but also some of Vlad's own subjects accused of betrayal or disloyalty, were impaled in front of the capital city of Târgoviște. These bodies were arranged in meticulous formations, placed on stakes in rows and columns that resembled a grotesque, symmetrical forest. The purpose was not only to punish, but to send a clear message to Mehmed and his forces. This was the cost of crossing Vlad Tepes. Contemporary accounts, including those from Venetian ambassador Antonio Bonfini and Byzantine chronicler Laonikos Chalkokondyles, describe the scene with chilling detail. When Mehmed's army arrived at Târgoviște, they found themselves confronted with this gruesome spectacle. Even the seasoned Ottoman soldiers, who had fought in numerous battles across Europe and Asia, were reportedly shaken. The terror of seeing so many bodies impaled on stakes, some still alive, was enough to halt Mehmed's advance. Tursun Bey, a historian accompanying Mehmed's army, recorded that the Sultan, accustomed to the horrors of war, was visibly disturbed by the scale of the punishment. It wasn't just the brutality that shocked him, it was the psychological message embedded in the display. Vlad had made it clear that he would not only defend his land, but would break the will of anyone who dared challenge him. The impaled bodies were not just casualties, they were trophies of a war fought not only with weapons, but with fear. Vlad's use of impalement also served to maintain strict control over his own people. For even the smallest offenses, such as stealing or disloyalty, impalement could be the punishment. This method of enforcement was meant to instill discipline and remind the population of Vlad's absolute power. According to reports by the Saxon chronicler Michael Beheim, Vlad once sentenced a woman to be impaled for lying about her husband's work ethic, a seemingly minor infraction that he considered a threat to civic order. To his enemies, impalement was the ultimate expression of terror, a death so grotesque and public that it became a symbol of Vlad's unrelenting power. But for Vlad, it was more than just a punishment. It was an assertion of dominance, a reminder that in Wallachia, only his law would prevail. As Vlad's campaign against the Ottoman forces continued, his psychological warfare grew even more terrifying. It was not enough for him to display the bodies of his enemies. Vlad took his terror tactics a step further, sending living, mutilated captives back to Sultan Mehmed II. These prisoners were not spared out of mercy. Far from it. Vlad's mutilation of his captives was a calculated move designed to humiliate and terrorize the Ottoman forces. He would intentionally disfigure his prisoners, marking them with permanent scars, and send them back to Mehmed not as fighters, but as living warnings. The mutilation was not just physical pain, it was a calculated psychological weapon aimed directly at the heart of the Ottoman Empire. According to various historical accounts, including those preserved in Slavic texts like the Skazani o Draculae Vovode, the tale of Prince Dracula, Vlad would have his captives' eyes gouged out, their noses and ears removed, and their limbs disfigured. Some prisoners were even branded with hot irons or had symbolic marks etched into their skin. The brutality of these acts was meant to send a clear message to Mehmed, that Vlad feared no retaliation, that he would stop at nothing to break the will of his enemies. But the physical disfigurement wasn't the only weapon in Vlad's arsenal. The psychological torment inflicted on these prisoners was equally important. Vlad's mutilated captives were not executed. No, they were sent back to their leaders alive to carry the message of Vlad's resolve. These living, disfigured men were no longer warriors. They were walking symbols of horror, sent to terrorize the Ottoman forces. The impact of these mutilated prisoners was profound. When they returned to Mehmed's camp, they were a grim reminder of the kind of ruler Vlad Tepes was. To the Ottoman soldiers, these men were living proof that their leader had no mercy, no respect for life, and no fear of retaliation. The sight of these mutilated captives walking back to the Ottoman camp served as a chilling reminder that their enemies' cruelty knew no bounds. Some historians speculate that the disfigurement of the prisoners may have been a form of religious provocation, particularly toward the Muslim Ottoman soldiers. The mutilations could have been seen as an attack on their beliefs, a challenge to their identity. However, this view is not universally agreed upon, as there are conflicting sources that suggest Vlad's primary motive was simply to break the morale of the Ottoman forces. In any case, the effect on Mehmed and his army was undeniable. The sight of mutilated prisoners, returned to them by their enemy, sent a shockwave through the Ottoman ranks. Mehmed, who had already witnessed the horrors of impalement and the destruction of his army's resources, now faced a more personal affront. His soldiers were not just fighting a man who would burn his land and display the bodies of his enemies. They were fighting a man who was willing to go to unimaginable lengths to humiliate and destroy them. Vlad's use of mutilated prisoners was a masterstroke of psychological warfare. These men were not just tools of terror, they were living proclamations of Vlad's power and his refusal to be intimidated. For Mehmed and his forces, these living warnings were as much a part of the battle as any sword or spear. By the time the Ottoman forces finally reached the gates of Târgoviște, the damage was done. The combination of Vlad Tepes's scorched earth tactics, his psychological warfare, and the terrifying spectacle of impaled bodies and mutilated prisoners had already done its work. Mehmed II, the Sultan who had conquered Constantinople and built one of the most powerful empires in history, found himself facing a foe who refused to submit to traditional warfare. Instead of a typical military confrontation, he was encountering a ruler whose methods were so brutal, so ruthless, that they defied all expectations. The siege of Târgoviște ended in failure for Mehmed. His forces were exhausted, starved, and demoralized, and the Sultan had no choice but to retreat. The campaign had cost the Ottoman Empire dearly, both in terms of lives lost and morale shattered. Mehmed, who was accustomed to winning with overwhelming force, had learned the hard way that in the brutal world of Vlad the Impaler, victory could be won without ever engaging in a direct battle. Vlad's success in this campaign did not stem from military superiority. It stemmed from his ability to use terror as a weapon. His ability to control the battlefield through psychological warfare was unparalleled. He had turned his land into a weapon, his people into pawns, and his enemies into victims of their own fear. Vlad's tactics were so effective that they became a legend, not only in the Ottoman Empire, but throughout Europe. His name became synonymous with cruelty and terror, and his image as the Impaler became etched in history. But Vlad's reign was not without consequences. While he succeeded in his immediate goals, defending Wallachia from the Ottomans and establishing his rule with an iron fist. His brutal methods left scars on his own people as well. His reputation for cruelty was not limited to his enemies. Within his own realm, the fear of Vlad's punishment kept the population in line, but it also fostered resentment. Many viewed his reign as one of terror rather than leadership, and his eventual downfall came not from external forces, but from internal betrayal and political maneuvering. Yet the legacy of Vlad Tepes as a master of psychological warfare endured. His tactics of impalement, mutilation, and terror became a part of the folklore of the Balkans, and his name lived on in the stories and legends of Europe. In the centuries that followed, the myth of Dracula, the vampire who would drink the blood of his victims, was born, partly inspired by the brutal ruler who had once ruled with such terrifying control. Vlad's actions remain a topic of fascination and debate. Was he a tyrant, a monster, or a hero who did what was necessary to defend his homeland? Perhaps all three. His legacy is a stark reminder of how power can be wielded, not just with armies, but with fear. The tactics he employed, the psychological manipulation he perfected, and the sheer terror he instilled in his enemies left an indelible mark on history. His story raises questions about the nature of cruelty and the limits of power, questions that are still relevant today. Vlad Tepes's name may be synonymous with blood and fear, but in the end it was his unyielding will to resist, his refusal to surrender to the might of the Ottoman Empire that defined him. For better or worse, Vlad the Impaler's reign serves as a chilling example of how far a leader might go to protect their realm, and how deeply fear can shape history.